You're listening to Media Savvy Moms with Melody and Marilyn. Open, honest conversations about parenting and pornography. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Media Savvy Moms. Today, we are going to talk about having early talks with our kids about sex and how that helps to prepare them to reject pornography later on in life. And we have a mom with us today, Kayley Lynch. Her husband and her 4 little crazy kids live with her in Oshawa, Ontario. And her kids range in age from 9 to 15. They have 3 girls and 1 boy. So you help balance us out, right, Kayley? Because between us, Marilyn and I have 8 boys. So yay for our girl mom on the show. Before her kids were born, she became ASL English certified as an interpreter. And then she started having her kids and became her most favorite job ever, a stay-at-home mom for 13 years. Recently, she completed her diploma as an educational assistant, and now she's working part-time as an undergrad, majoring in French and minoring in Canadian studies, and also working part-time as an educational assistant and back as an ASL interpreter. She loves music and has tried to instill that in her children too. I hear that your kids play the piano, violin, and also the bagpipes.
It's true. One plays the bagpipes. One is enough.
That sounds adventurous. All right. And I am going to turn the time over to Marilyn for the interview.
Hey, Kayley, so good to have you here today. And if any of our listeners have been following along with Parents Aware for a while, you may recognize Kayley's name as the author of, Kayley, what's it called?
It's called You Mean It's Not a BA-jina?
That's right. So hilarious blog post. And so this is a bit of a sequel to that. We just want to check in a few years later and see how life is going in the Lynch home. So why don't we just start out by you tell me what your favorite thing about parenting in the digital world is and maybe what your biggest challenges are.
Okay, so my favorite thing about parenting in the media or in the digital world is Google. Google has saved my life. Actually, Google saves my life on the daily. My son is super, super curious and is constantly asking me questions. And so Google helps me out on the daily with questions that I never thought I'd have to answer. Like, how do you make a gummy bear? Or it could be anything. What does an old-fashioned telephone look like? I got that one the other day. And what he really meant was like the ones, I'm not talking about the ones like turn of the century. I'm talking about like an old-fashioned one with a cord. What does that look like?
That's so sad. We're old-fashioned now.
So I had to Google that and show him a picture of what an old-fashioned telephone looked like. But he's constantly asking me questions, and Google saves my life all the time. So I'm grateful for that. And, helping with homework or what's for dinner, Google's amazing. Or, the internet in general.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So much.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt here because we call Google out on the dirty dozen, but I know that you've talked to me about how you manage Google or your son's questions over the years. And you told me once you had a question of the day. So how did that work?
So yeah, when I say Google, I guess what I mean is the internet. I don't always use Google, but just a means for searching up information. And it's been particularly important for me for my son, who has always been so curious about everything, always demanding answers and wanting to know how things work and why. And especially when he was a bit younger, he used to ask me so many questions. And as a stay-at-home mom, oh my gosh, I loved being with him, but I could not keep up. I couldn't keep up with all the questions he had. And he just wanted to know the ins and outs of everything. And so we came up with this system called Question of the Day, where I said to him, you're allowed to ask me like one question that we'll actually look up and research. And it took us, sometimes you'd go down the rabbit hole. It would take you a couple hours to answer a question. So we came up with Question of the Day. So where he'd come up to me and he'd say, okay, here's my question of the day. He'd ask me one question, and it was always like, it wasn't easy ever. It was like, what is cancer? And then, question of the day became an hour or two of research. And sometimes question of the day became question of the week. And we would just go on, and he'd get into a topic and we'd research it a lot. But it was always, and it still is always, with me beside him. That was part of it, so that we could sit down together and look at something together and learn together.
What a great way to use the internet and use it safely. I live on Google every day, so it wasn't that I was shaming you for using Google. So that's your favorite thing. What's your biggest challenge?
Well, and now as they're growing a bit older, but even before, is the distraction it presents my family. Keeps us from staying focused on things that I'd rather us stay focused on. So constantly keeping on top of rules for the house, our house rules about media and internet use, and even now phone use as my kids get a bit older, and constantly being distracted by that and having to remind them of the rules, I guess, make sure they stay on track and that it doesn't consume them. I'm always concerned that, media in general will consume them. So it's just constantly having to monitor it. It's become a big deal in our family.
Monitoring and worry, I imagine, over that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump into the topic of the day. You've made some key decisions over the years about how you'd approach the sex talk in your home. So can you share with us how you've done that, or how your attitude has changed, or maybe even a story or two of what that looks like in your house?
Yeah, sure. So from my previous article, I had written a lot about how growing up, and I think this is pretty common for most of us of the same age group and even older, sex was not something we talked about, or we tried not to talk about it as much as possible. And because of that, I think my perception of what sex was when I was younger was, I guess, skewed. I felt like it was gross or dirty or inappropriate. If we didn't talk about it, there must be something wrong with it. And so when I approached the sex talk with my kids originally, I think I tried not to come to it with that same angle, but I really struggled to wrap my head around how to, introduce this topic that I knew I wanted to become an important focal point in our family's culture, but I didn't know what I was doing. And so from that article, I explained, I guess, my first aha moment with how to approach the topic of sex and sexuality and healthy relationships with sex. It was really an aha moment for me to finally get a sense of how to talk to them about it, that it wasn't a secret, it wasn't dirty, and it wasn't gross. So moving forward from that, I've tried to broach the topic when I can, and I've tried to incorporate it in conversations where it's natural, and even sometimes when it's not so natural to bring it up. I sometimes get a little urge to just say, okay, today we're going to talk about, I don't know, sometimes I hijack the dinner conversation and say, okay, we're talking about porn right now. We're not talking about porn more than we're talking about internet safety or, a certain topic about it.
For sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think over the years, my perspective's changed. So I was thinking about this same topic last night. Now, you have to know that, and Marilyn does know this about me, I have a fear of spiders, but I'm going to put it as an irrational fear of spiders. I know I'm not the only one, but it's pretty extreme.
It's very extreme, yes.
I hate them, and they terrify me. And when my oldest was a toddler, she found one in the house. And I'm not talking about a little one, guys. It was gross and big. And she was like, oh, she was so excited to see this spider in our house. And I remember thinking, okay, I can't wreck this for her. I can't imprint the same fear of spiders on her that I have. So I tried so hard to be super cool about showing this spider. And I did. I was like, yeah, isn't that amazing? And inside I wanted to puke, but we were talking about the spider. And then I had to shoo it out of my house. And that's all I'll say. But it was terrifying for me, but I felt like I did a good job of keeping my fear in and did not imprint that. But fast forward 15 years later, I have not kept up with that same mentality. I have openly expressed my disgust and fear of spiders. I have broken down crying over them in our house before, and she's witnessed every one of them and now has a fear of spiders. Probably, to rival my own. But my point is that I have imprinted my fear of spiders onto her, and I regret that. And And so I guess what I'm saying is I didn't want to do the same thing with my kids about sex or sexuality. I really wanted to change that narrative. And so to do that, I've really had to take a look at my own views of sex and sexuality, and how do I change it for myself so that I can imprint something more positive onto my kids.
That's a great attitude to have. We're going to take a break right now. So in the first half, we've talked about the things that we bring into this conversation, how we create a healthy environment in our homes to talk about, answer questions about any subject, including sex. And then in the second half, we're going to come back and maybe discuss what happens when a child does think that this is still disgusting, despite your best efforts, and how to transition that into a talk about pornography.
People are always asking us, what is the best way to start the sex talk with my kids? And I love to recommend the book 30 Days of Sex Talks by Educate and Empower Kids. This is such a great book for so many reasons, one of which is that it's divided into 3 age-appropriate volumes. One is ages 3 to 7, one ages 8 to 11, and one for ages 12 and up. Because let's face it, you are not going to have the same sex talks with your 3-year-old as you are with your 16-year-old. 30 Days of Sex Talks contains the most meaningful discussions you're going to have with your child, made easy. Inside the book is a code that will allow you to download topic cards that you can print out and place in strategic locations like a mirror, the refrigerator, or in your pocket to remind you and your child to start talking. They've made it easy to engage your child in conversations about relationships, affection, anatomy, boundaries, predators, online dangers, and many other vital topics. Look for the 30 Days of Sex Talks on Amazon or visit the Educate and Empower Kids website at educateempowerkids.org.
And we're back. So before the break, Kayley, you mentioned that it was really important for you to discuss the topic of sex in your home and not have it secretive or mysterious or even disgusting. But I recall, because we are good friends, you told me a story when your youngest was, that your youngest was quite disgusted when she realized what was going on behind closed doors.
Right. So that's true. And I thought by this point, I'm still learning this process along with my kids. I'm still learning how to talk about sex and how to do all this with my kids. So this was a learning curve for me as well. In my original post, You Mean It's Not a Vagina, I talk about this moment I had with my 4 kids on the bed where I was confronted, I was challenged to finally confront my fears about talking to my kids about sex. And I did it. I was so brave. I thought I was the best in that moment. Go me. And I thought, there, I've done it. I've talked about it. And, it's smooth sailing from here on out. And so my youngest was 4 at that time. And then over the years, I know we still talked about it. I thought when it was appropriate. But there was one day we were driving in the car. It was just my 2 youngest. So my youngest, she was 4 at the time. And then my son, she was 6 at the time in the car. Mm-hmm. And my son was 8. And we were having this discussion in the car. And somehow we got talking about eggs. And somehow that moved over to eggs in moms. And all of a sudden I found myself in the same position again, where I was having to talk about sex. But this time I thought, okay, no problem. I've got this. We can do this. But it was some of her questions that kind of made me think, okay, she actually doesn't remember the conversation we had 2 years ago where I laid it all out. I tried to give every appropriate anatomical term I could think of, and I laid it all out. But of course, it makes sense. She was 4 and she didn't remember that conversation. So I thought, okay, we're going to have to do this.
So here we go again.
So, but this time I was like, no problem. I've got this. We can do this. And so I did. Again, I explained the whole thing in the car to her using, start explaining the whole process, using every appropriate term. I did not hide anything from her. And of course, my son being my son, who I've already mentioned, in between all of this is looking out the car window and he's talking about bugs and whatever. He's, none of this has ever fazed him. It's all scientific facts to him. It's never fazed him. But at the end of this conversation where I had kind of said, and that's how we make a baby, I guess, or something like that, there was silence in the back of the van for a couple of minutes. And then all of a sudden I heard her say, "That's disgusting."
Well done, Mom.
I was like, oh, well, I thought I did it okay. But it was a good opportunity for me again to say, okay, there's a challenge for myself. Okay, I remember thinking that definitely growing up because it was secret, it was inappropriate, we never talked about it. And so I wanted to challenge that perception for her. So it was an awesome opportunity for me to again go in and say, no, it's not disgusting, it's awesome. And this is why. And so we were able to talk about all the positives that come along with sexuality, of course, in an age appropriate manner, but I was able to really address that with her. And it was a really awesome experience. And then
did you say your son was, cheering you on?
Right. So yes, my son being my son, like I mentioned, none of this phases him. It's all science. It's all facts to him, which he loves. And so he was, that's not disgusting. And this is why it's so cool. And Mom, did you also know that chameleons are really cool? Because, like all through this conversation, he's just weaving in and out, talking about chameleons and sex, and probably poop made its way into that conversation at some point, because it always does. But it didn't faze him, but he was able to just kind of cheer his little sister on and finally be like, no, it's not disgusting. It's awesome. And in the same breath, he said, hey, Mom, can I have a chameleon? And that was the end. I had these two crazy different kids in the car. One who was reserved and, not sure about the conversation. The other one who was willing to talk about sex as much as he was willing to talk about chameleons or,
Well, I love that story for 3 reasons. So first, just what you said, our kids are different. They're going to respond differently to the conversation. 2, it just shows that it's not a one and done conversation. You started the conversation when your youngest was 4. You thought you've had multiple conversations, and yet a couple of years later, it's still a mystery to her and still disgusting, and so worth bringing up again. And then that you're being proactive about it, and you're instilling your thoughts and your ideas and letting them feel comfortable with that.
Right.
So how do you think that talking about, because this is a podcast about parenting and pornography, and so far we've just talked about talking to your kids and about sex. So how does that help you establish a framework on which you can then talk to them about pornography? And what does that look like in your home?
Right. So that's a good question, actually. And I guess if there's one thing I've learned, like you mentioned over the years, it's that you can't be done this conversation. You can't be done any conversation, especially when it surrounds pornography as well. So as I've learned to be open and consistent with my discussions about sex, it's also prompted me to realize that if we need to have this conversation again, I think we need to talk about pornography a lot and often and in appropriate times. And so talking about sex has also prompted me, like I said before, to kind of sometimes hijack the dinner conversation and say, okay, now we're going to talk about substance abuse. Again, my son, he's very anti-drugs. In his
It's better than being pro-drugs.
No, that's not a complaint. I definitely cheer him on. But just in health class recently, they did a study on drugs, and so he's always coming home again, the little scientist, did you know that? And then he'll rhyme off this or that fact about cocaine or heroin or something, how addictive they are and how much he hates them. And it has been an excellent gateway for me to then say, you're absolutely right, this is why these drugs are horrible. Did you also know that pornography acts the same way? It's a drug, and it's shaped our conversations around pornography as well. So I've been able to talk about pornography and talk about it often for a few reasons. One is because I do believe it's a drug and I don't want my kids addicted, but also because I want my kids to have all the information they can when they're confronted with it. And they have been in a variety of settings, but I want them to be able to recognize, okay, this is pornography, and now I know what to do about it. So we've been able that way to set up some house rules about what to do when we're confronted with pornography or things like that as well.
So what's your approach if a child comes to you or do your children come to you when they see inappropriate pictures? And
Right. So that's been another actually interesting learning curve for me. So, it's not been, this has been a continuous timeline of talking about sex and pornography over the years. And so I guess earlier on when we started talking about sex, we also started talking about pornography. And right away, I wanted to establish some rules for my kids to follow. And my biggest rule is, well, once I helped them, I hope, understand what pornography is and how to identify it, their next job is to, whatever it is, close the laptop, shut off the iPad, walk away. But their next job is to come to me and tell me. And I've reminded them multiple times, it's not because you're in trouble, it's because I want to help. Just like any other drug, I want to help, and it's okay. That being said, that's not always the way it's happened. I know of at least 2 instances where, again, I thought, okay, I guess we should talk about pornography again. And I hijack the conversation and say, okay, just a reminder, these are our rules. Twice my kids have said, actually, each of my oldest daughters have said to me, oh yeah, actually, I have seen pornography. And then that opens up that new conversation, like, oh, you have, and where was that? And, then they can come to me and explain to me. But even if I've talked about it a million times, it doesn't mean that they remember in the moment.
that it registers to act
right
according to those rules or guidelines.
Right, because they don't, it's not like they're seeing hardcore pornography as much as they're seeing an inappropriate ad or, especially on their iPad or iPod. My one daughter forgot that one of the ads she'd seen on a game that she was playing was inappropriate and was able to then say, oh yeah, that was pornography. And then we were able to look at that app and talk about that. So again, that opened up another avenue for us. But it's that constant reminder. I figure if I have to remind them every day to brush their teeth and wash their hands, they're not going to remember all the steps, to combat pornography themselves.
That's a really good point. It takes time, it takes practice, and going back to it, even if they didn't come to you and follow exactly, like bringing it up in retrospect, you're still having the same conversation. You're still helping them process that information and make healthy choices about it.
Right.
So that's really good. All right, we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon. Over the years, because you're such a great new age mom now, has it become easier? Is it still the same anxiety to talk about it, or is it just old hat now?
It's funny. You should ask that to me today, because I would have said, yeah, it's fine. It's old hat. We do it all the time. And then last night, for whatever reason, and I promise it wasn't in preparation for this, but last night, organically in conversation, my youngest daughter, who's now 9, said to me, what's masturbation? And it caught me for a second again. And I thought, oh, and just for a split second, I thought, I don't know if I want to do this tonight. But then we went ahead and we did it, and it was actually fine. But I guess what I'm saying is it's never, I don't think it's ever over. I don't think it's ever done. And it challenges me every time. Not because I don't want to talk to my daughter about masturbation, but because I don't want my daughter to have to learn about it yet. I want her to, I think it's just losing her innocence that makes me more sad than anything. So is it easier to talk about it? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make it easy? No, if that makes sense. I constantly have to check myself and remind myself and remind my kids. But I would say overall, the topic of sex and sexuality, which also leads into pornography, that has all become so much more easy for me as we talk about it, and also as I challenge my own perceptions or misconceptions about sexuality. As I've done that, I've been able to approach the topics with more ease. And I think my kids have been gracious enough to accept my offerings as well. And they're comfortable with it as well, I would say now, more than ever.
Oh, I love that. So you're more comfortable with it, but it doesn't mean your kids aren't still challenging you with, that's the job of kids, isn't it? To challenge us and to test us on whether we can answer all their crazy questions.
Come all the time.
So we're going to turn it back to Melody to give us a little summary of the show.
All right. Great conversation, ladies. Some of the highlights that stuck out to me were at the beginning, we were talking about Google and just the internet in general. But really, what stood out to me was that you were talking about being a really engaged parent when it comes to using the internet. And you were talking about sitting side by side with your son and with that question of the day idea. You weren't talking about, okay, go Google it, kid. That's really different. You really are aligned with our values, where we talk about being engaged and using technology for good and using it for helpful and being engaged with them. You also talked about how our generation maybe has kind of a shroud over sex, and how it may be kind of full of shame, and how we need to change that conversation with our kids. It's so important. I love how you talked about hijacking the dinner conversation and having these conversations in the car, and just making it, we talk about talking shoulder to shoulder with our kids and just doing these kind of conversations. It doesn't have to be okay, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk and have this. It's just becomes part of our normal daily routine to have these talks. It's a beautiful thing when we can do that. And you also said, and this is a quotable, talk about pornography and talk about it often. This is not a one and done, definitely. We also, great point. If I have to remind them every day to wash their hands and brush their teeth, of course, we're going to have to remind them about how to resist pornography. You went through this great process of teaching them how to understand what porn is, how to recognize it, how to close the laptop, turn it off and walk away, and how to come to me. And I love how you said, I teach them to come to me because I want to help. Not because we want to be punitive and want to shame them, but because I want to help. Those are important words to say to our kids and for them to understand, but that we have to remind them to do it, just like brushing their teeth and washing their hands and picking up their socks, right? And then we talked about how our kids, we want this to get easier over time. We do it over and over. But our kids will always continue to challenge us, and that's okay because we're human and we're learning and we're just taking this a day at a time.
Kayley, do you have a challenge for our listeners?
I do. I was thinking about this, and if I were to challenge your listeners, I would suggest to them to take a personal inventory of your own feelings, your own conceptions of sex, sexuality, pornography. And then from there, decide what it is that you actually want to share with your kids, so that you're ready to share those things. For me and my family, it's to share everything. For you, it might not be, but that you're really aware of where you stand or what your own feelings towards that is. And then once you've figured that out, to bring up anything you can about sex at some point this week. Obviously, it can become awkward. If you can find a way to weave it into a conversation so that you get that conversation started, try to do that. And I would say on the weekly, in my house, we could talk about sex. I could weave it in every day if I wanted to. We don't, but it is possible.
So there's your challenge. Talk about sex this week and maybe every week thereafter. Take care. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you like what you heard, remember to subscribe. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, or email us directly at mediasavvymoms@gmail.com. We'd love to get your feedback.